My sister's fingers closed around the edge of my dinner plate before I had taken my second bite. Porcelain scraped across white linen. For half a second, I thought Caroline was reaching for the gravy boat. Then she lifted my plate clean off the table and pushed it back into my hands. "Go eat in the kitchen, adopted girl," she said. "This table is for real family." She didn't whisper it. Nearly 50 people filled the private dining room of the old inn outside Boston. Cousins, aunts, family, friends, people who had known the Grants since before Richard and Margaret adopted me at 6. Conversations thinned around us without completely stopping. Forks slowed. Someone near the fireplace laughed once, then seemed to realize nobody else had. I looked at Caroline, 31 years old, executive director of the Grant Family Outreach Foundation. Perfect cream dress. Perfect donor luncheon smile. My older sister had spent the last 7 years standing behind podiums talking about dignity, inclusion, and the importance of making vulnerable people feel that they belonged. Now she was holding my Thanksgiving dinner against my chest, like she was returning something that had been delivered to the wrong address. Mom didn't tell her to stop. Margaret Grant lifted her wineglass and gave me the smallest curve of a smile. Dad was worse. Richard looked at my empty chair, then at cousin Andrew, who had arrived 20 minutes late. "Andrew," he said, pulling the chair out. "Sit here. We'll make room." Not for me. For him. The plate was warm against my palms. I had paid just under $30,000 for the room, the dinner, the wine, the rentals, transportation for the older relatives, taxes, and service fees. The contract had my name on it, not the foundation's. Mine. And behind Caroline, on a mahogany sideboard decorated with miniature pumpkins and eucalyptus, sat a stack of glossy brochures for the Grant Family Outreach Foundation. The cover showed an 8-year-old girl with uneven bangs and a missing front tooth. Me. Under my childhood face were 4 words printed in gold. "Love makes a family." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because sometimes hypocrisy got so precise, it stopped hurting for a moment and became useful. I was 28 years old, and I worked as a grants compliance manager at a large teaching hospital in the Boston area. My job was built around details people like to call technical until those details cost them money. Scope, authority, dates, versions, who approved what, and for how long. My family had spent years treating permission like gratitude once given, permanently owed. I shifted the plate into one hand and took out my phone. 2 days earlier, Elaine Porter, the Foundation's independent board secretary, had told me Evelyn Shaw could review the complete correspondence archive concerning the use of my name and image only if I gave written authorization. I had told Elaine to wait. I wanted Thanksgiving finished first. Not because I was afraid of Caroline, because once the review began, I knew exactly what my family would say. Olivia got emotional. Olivia misunderstood. Olivia was angry about something personal and decided to punish a charity. I had spent 14 months making sure that when the day came, I would have more than anger. Caroline had just moved the day forward. I typed one message to Elaine. "I authorize release of the full correspondence archive to Evelyn now. Include the September withdrawal. No summary." I pressed send. Then I slid my phone into my purse. Caroline raised one eyebrow. "That it?" she asked. I glanced at my plate. "You wanted my seat." Her smile widened. I set the plate on the service counter near the kitchen doors. "Enjoy it." Mom's voice followed me. "Olivia, don't be dramatic." I put on my coat. That was the thing about my mother. She could watch someone remove my plate, remove my chair, and remove me from the definition of family, then accuse me of creating the scene because I walked away from it. I didn't answer. I had learned that explanations were expensive around the Grants. They took as much as you gave them and returned nothing useful. I had almost reached the foyer when Caroline's phone chimed. Then Dad's. Then another phone farther down the table. I stopped beside the coat check, far enough away that nobody could mistake it for me waiting to be invited back. Caroline picked up her phone. Her expression changed before she could hide it. She read the email once, then again. Her fork remained suspended over her plate. "Dad." Richard looked down at his own screen. Caroline's voice dropped. "Why is Evelyn freezing the campaign?" Mom stopped smiling. Richard's eyes moved across the message. I already knew what it would say, because Elaine forwarded me a copy seconds later. Effective immediately. Pause all scheduled public-facing use of Olivia Grant's name, image, biography, or attributed advisory role pending governance review. Preserve all current files, drafts, revision histories, and scheduled materials. No deletion, substitution, backdating, or replacement of existing versions. It wasn't a finding. It wasn't an accusation. It was a preservation instruction from the independent board chair. That distinction mattered. Especially to me. Caroline looked toward the foyer. Our eyes met. For years, she had mistaken my refusal to make scenes for an inability to make moves. I didn't stay long enough to correct her. I walked out. The cold hit harder than I expected. November air slipped beneath my coat as the inn door closed behind me. Gravel crunched under my shoes on the way to the parking lot. I had made it halfway to my car when my phone started vibrating. Mom. Then Caroline. Then Mom again. I put the phone on silent. My hands weren't shaking. That surprised me less than it would have a year earlier. I had practiced leaving long before I actually did it. Not from Thanksgiving. From them. The dinner had been booked 6 months earlier, before my exit plan had hardened from an idea into a calendar. Mom had called me in May with the same voice she used whenever a request had already become an obligation in her mind. This year should be special, she'd said. Your father's 61. Aunt Helen may not travel next year. Everyone's scattered. You're good at organizing these things. That last sentence had followed me through most of adulthood. You're good at it. Which usually meant, you will do it. I signed the venue agreement personally. Historic room buyout, full dinner service, wine package, transportation for several older relatives, staffing, rentals, taxes, service charge. By the time my doubts about the foundation became serious, canceling would have meant losing most of the deposit and punishing a venue staff that had done nothing to me. So I kept the booking, not because I thought a beautiful Thanksgiving would finally make Margaret look at me like Caroline. I had stopped waiting for that years ago. The dinner became something else in my head. The last large promise I had already made to the Grant family. The final open invoice in a system of emotional accounting I had never agreed to, but had spent years paying anyway. Margaret's favorite phrase was, after everything we did for you. It could follow anything. A tuition argument. A Christmas request. A foundation fundraiser. A weekend Caroline needed help. Being adopted at 6 had somehow become a debt with no principal amount and no maturity date. I wanted one clean line after Thanksgiving. No unfinished promise. No deposit they could say I abandoned. No elderly aunt stranded without transportation because I decided to make a point. I would pay what I had already agreed to pay. Then I would stop. It wasn't cheap courage. Before the final payment, my savings were a little over $50,000. After the venue, transportation, and remaining charges cleared, I would have roughly 4 to 5 months of living expenses in reserve. Enough. Not comfortable. Enough. That distinction mattered too. I had spent 14 months separating my life from theirs in ways no one could see from a Thanksgiving table. My apartment lease was mine alone. I had lived there for 18 months. No Grant family member had a key. My banking was separate. No shared credit card. No family phone plan. My passport, birth certificate, adoption records, employment documents, and every sentimental thing I couldn't replace had left my parents' house months ago. The first time Mom noticed my old bedroom drawers were empty, I told her I was decluttering. She believed me because people usually believe the explanation that inconveniences them least. By the time I reached my apartment that night, I had 17 missed calls. I ignored all of them. I locked the door behind me and stood in the quiet. 1 bedroom. Small kitchen. Secondhand dining table. A radiator that clicked too loudly when the heat came on. It was the least impressive room the Grants had ever associated with me. It was also the only one nobody could tell me to leave. I took off my shoes, opened my laptop, and pulled a gray document box from the bottom shelf of my bookcase. The label read, GFF name. Image, role. I worked in compliance because I liked records more than recollections. People remembered what protected them. Documents were less sentimental. I opened the first folder. February. Caroline's email requesting permission to use one photograph of me for the spring campaign. My response sat directly beneath it. You may use this photo for the spring campaign only. Please send me final copy before publication. 5 months ago, that sentence had seemed almost overly careful. Tonight it looked like a boundary painted in fluorescent ink. Spring campaign only. The campaign ended in May. Yet my photograph appeared in a donor deck in June. My adoption story appeared in an August newsletter. Then, on September 3rd, after I noticed the foundation had begun describing me as an informal lived experience advisor, I sent Caroline and Richard a formal email. No emotion. No accusation. Just scope. I wrote that I was withdrawing consent for future public-facing use of my name, image, personal adoption history, or implied advisory affiliation, unless separately approved in writing. On September 8th, Caroline answered. Understood. We'll revisit after year-end. She never did. October board minutes contained one line noting that I had requested to step back from public-facing use. I had not known whether that line would ever matter, so I had preserved it. Original PDF. Source. Date. Version. No notes written over the file. At the hospital, I told junior staff the same thing constantly. Never damage your original just because you're certain you understand what it means. Certainty changes. Evidence shouldn't. My phone lit again. This time it was not family. Evelyn Shaw. I answered. Olivia. Yes. This is Evelyn. Elaine confirmed your authorization. Do you have a few minutes? I do. Her voice was calm enough to disappoint anyone hoping for a rescuer. I want to be clear about where we are, she said. I issued a temporary preservation and marketing pause. That is not a finding against Caroline or anyone else. I understand. You previously gave the foundation permission to use your photograph. Yes, for specific campaigns. You've attended fundraisers? Yes. Spoken with donors? Yes. Proofread foundation materials? Yes. A pause. You see why those facts matter. I do. If there's a later dispute about whether the foundation reasonably understood you to be involved, those facts will be part of it. They should be. That seemed to surprise her. Good. I wasn't asking anyone to build me a cleaner story than the one that existed. Evelyn continued. Elaine is preserving the archive as received. I'm going to ask governance to compare current public materials against the correspondence. Until then, I'd prefer you not characterize tonight's freeze as a board conclusion. I won't. And Olivia? Yes? I'm aware something happened at dinner. Of course she was. The Grant family could move a narrative faster than most organizations moved a memo. I'm not asking about that tonight, she said. I'd rather you didn't. Another pause. What do you want from the process? I looked at the gray box on my table. Accurate attribution. That's all? For now. And from this point forward, anything involving my role, name, image, or the foundation comes to me in writing. No family calls, no verbal understandings. That's reasonable. I also want every reference to me tied to a source. Not Olivia was involved. What involvement? What date? What authorization? Evelyn exhaled softly. That sounds like a compliance manager. It's what I know how to do. After we hung up, Elaine emailed me confirmation that the archive had been received and preserved. No conclusions. No dramatic promise. Exactly what I wanted. At 11:43, Caroline finally stopped calling and sent an email. The subject line was, "This has gone too far." I almost admired the speed with which she had reached that conclusion. Her message began without a single reference to my plate. No apology. No explanation. Instead, Olivia, you have always been part of our lived experience advisory work. You have attended events, reviewed messaging, spoken with donors, and allowed your story to be part of the foundation since its earliest years. Freezing year-end materials over a family disagreement is disproportionate and could hurt people who depend on us. I read it twice, not because it upset me, because of one phrase. Lived experience advisory work. That was different from saying I inspired the foundation. Different from saying I attended events. Different from saying I spoke to donors. A role had structure, appointment, scope, authority, sometimes compensation, sometimes meeting records. At minimum, evidence that the person knew the role existed. I opened my calendar and searched the foundation's name. Fundraisers. 2 donor dinners. 3 proofreading requests. 1 panel 6 years earlier where I had spoken about adoption. No advisory meetings. No advisory committee. No appointment. No agreement. No role description. I replied with 4 sentences. Please identify the document appointing me to this advisory role, its effective date, its scope, and the meetings in which I participated in that capacity. Until then, do not represent my attendance at fundraising or proofreading of public materials as acceptance of an advisory appointment. Please keep further communication on this matter in writing. Send. Less than 5 minutes later, another email arrived. Not from Caroline. Elaine. Governance has authorized me to provide the attached excerpt for role verification. Please confirm whether the description is accurate. I opened the secure document. At first it looked ordinary. A section from a final grant packet. Program structure. Community participation. Advisory resources. Then I saw my name. Lived experience. Advisor. Olivia Grant. I stared at it. Not shocked. Not yet. I checked the footer. Final submission version. Then, the date. November 17. 9 days before Thanksgiving. I called Elaine. When was this submitted? November 17th. To whom? The renewal funder. I can't provide the entire application outside the review yet, but governance needed you to verify the role attribution. Was this a draft? No. I looked again at my name. Elaine, I never held that role. I'll record your response. Did Caroline submit it? I can't characterize authorship until the revision history is reviewed. That was the right answer. It was also enough. I ended the call and sat at my little dining table while the radiator clicked behind me. My phone still held the family group chat. 43 unread messages now. I didn't open them. Caroline could tell every cousin in Massachusetts that I had ruined Thanksgiving because she hurt my feelings. Margaret could say I was ungrateful. Richard could call me vindictive. None of it changed November 17th. None of it changed September 3rd. My name was sitting inside a document that had already left the foundation before Caroline ever touched my plate. Thanksgiving hadn't created the problem. It had only been the first night I stopped protecting them from the consequences of what they had done before it. By Friday morning, the argument Caroline wanted to have with me had already become irrelevant. At 7:20, I was standing beneath fluorescent lights on the 4th floor of the hospital, with a paper cup of coffee cooling beside my keyboard and a project coordinator waiting for me to approve a quarterly report. She tapped 1 sentence on the screen. The program director wants to keep this paragraph. She says it sounds stronger. I read it again. The report claimed a community outreach project had provided direct counseling services to more than 400 people. The approved grant scope said education and referral. Those were not the same thing. Did we provide counseling? I asked. No. Was counseling approved? No. Then we can't say we did. She shifted in the chair. But we referred them to counseling. Then say that. It sounds smaller. It is smaller. Her expression tightened for half a second before she nodded. Normally, that exchange would have ended there. That morning, the words stayed with me. What was approved? By whom? For what period? Which version went out? Those questions had no loyalty. They didn't care whether the person on the other side of the table was someone I loved, someone I disliked, or someone who had taken my dinner plate in front of 50 people. That was why I trusted them. A fact that hurt Caroline still had to be a fact. A fact that helped her still had to be included. By 8:15, I had opened a blank spreadsheet on my personal laptop and named it something deliberately boring. GFOF Attribution Chronology. No accusation in the title. No Caroline. No Richard. No Thanksgiving. Just what I could prove. The oldest annual report I could find publicly was from the year after I graduated college. Beneath a photograph of Margaret and Richard at a fundraiser was a paragraph about the foundation's origin. It referred to me as the daughter whose adoption inspired our commitment to vulnerable families. I copied the phrase into the spreadsheet. Source, date, document type, public or internal, authorization known or unknown. A year later, a donor newsletter called me a family ambassador. That made me stop. I searched my email. There was no message asking me to become a family ambassador. There was, however, an email from Caroline asking whether I could attend a Saturday breakfast because one donor loved hearing from someone who had actually lived the experience. I had attended. I had spoken for perhaps 6 minutes. At the time, ambassador had felt like harmless marketing language. The following year, the phrase changed again. Longtime supporter. That was true enough. I had donated to 2 events, proofread copy, and answered questions when Caroline called. Then came informal advisor. My coffee sat untouched beside me. The language had evolved so gradually that no individual step looked outrageous. That was what bothered me. Nobody had woken up one morning and announced that Olivia Grant would become official proof of the Grant family's goodness. The wording had simply moved a few inches every year. Inspiration, ambassador, supporter, informal advisor, lived experience advisor. Each version borrowed credibility from the one before it. Each sounded close enough to the last that challenging it would have made me seem petty. And the more formal the role became, the less often anyone had asked me for permission. The entry that mattered most appeared beside the current renewal cycle. November 17th Lived Experience Advisor Final Grant Submission. Below it, I added another line. September 3rd Written withdrawal of future public-facing consent and objection to implied advisory affiliation. Then another. September 8th Caroline acknowledges receipt. The order mattered more than Thanksgiving ever could. My phone buzzed at 9:40. A calendar invitation from Elaine. Governance verification meeting Monday, 10 a.m. Evelyn Shaw. Elaine Porter. Olivia Grant. No, Caroline. No, Richard. I accepted. Then another notification appeared. A family group email. Margaret had never liked group texts for serious matters. Email allowed her to sound composed. The subject line read, "A painful Thanksgiving." I almost deleted it without opening it. Instead, I forwarded it untouched into a folder labeled Narrative Timeline. Then I read, Mom wrote that a private disagreement between sisters had unfortunately spilled into the work of an organization serving vulnerable families. She said Caroline regretted that Thanksgiving had become tense. Not what Caroline had said. Not what she had done. Just that the evening had become tense, as if tension were weather. The next paragraph was worse. According to Mom, I had reacted in the heat of the moment by triggering a formal review that could damage the foundation's year-end work. Caroline replied to the group 11 minutes later. She wrote that she loved me, that she had spoken carelessly, and that she hoped I would separate our personal disagreement from the mission we have all built together. I read that sentence twice, then saved it. They had just committed themselves to a timeline. Thanksgiving first. Review second. Emotional retaliation. That was their version. Mine did not require anyone to believe my feelings. September 3rd existed whether they liked me or not. By Monday morning, I had added 3 more columns to the chronology. Claim. Supporting record. Contradicting record. That was the document open on my laptop when Evelyn appeared on the video call. Elaine joined a moment later from a conference room at the foundation. Good morning, Evelyn said. Morning. Elaine nodded. Olivia. There was no warmth in either woman's manner, and I was grateful for it. Evelyn began without mentioning Thanksgiving. I want to establish the facts of your prior involvement before we discuss the disputed role. Okay. Did you authorize the foundation to use photographs of you? Yes. More than once? Yes. Did you attend fundraising events? Yes. Did you speak to donors? Yes. Did you review written materials? Yes. Did you ever suggest edits? Yes. Did you ever refuse compensation for helping? I hesitated. Yes. Elaine looked down at her notes. Evelyn continued. Did anyone ever use the word advisor with you verbally before this year? That one required more care. Not as an appointment. That wasn't my question. No, I don't remember anyone directly telling me, you are an advisor. But Caroline sometimes asked for my opinion on adoption-related language. How often? Occasionally. More when I was younger. Did you respond? Yes. Then why is the description informal advisor necessarily inaccurate? There it was. The question I had known would come. My family would have hated it. I didn't. Because participation and appointment are different things, I said. So are proofreading and advisory authority. Evelyn's expression didn't change. Explain. If someone asks me whether a sentence about adoption sounds patronizing and I answer, that proves I answered a question. It doesn't prove I accepted an ongoing role. If the foundation wants to describe me as a formal or continuing advisor in a grant application, there should be some record defining what that means. Appointment letter? That would help. What else? Terms of reference, scope, meeting records, deliverables. Even an email saying, "Olivia, we are listing you in this capacity. Is that accurate?" Elaine asked. And none exists? I haven't seen one. Evelyn leaned slightly toward her screen. You understand that nonprofit organizations sometimes operate informally. Yes. And your last name is Grant? Yes. You are the founder's daughter? Yes. Which means the foundation may argue that your involvement was understood relationally rather than contractually. They can. And your response? Then it should be described relationally. Don't turn informal family participation into a professional role when the document leaves the building. For the first time, Elaine's pen stopped. Evelyn glanced down. I continued before either woman could respond. I'm not asking you to pretend I never helped them. I did. I'm asking you to distinguish what I actually did from what the application says I did. That distinction may be narrower than you think, Evelyn said. Then the records should show that. No speech about my childhood followed. No mention of Caroline's plate. Facts that helped her stayed in the record. So did the ones that didn't. Near the end of the call, Evelyn said, "While the internal review is open, do not contact the funder directly." My back stiffened. Is that a request or an instruction? A request from the chair while we verify the submission and determine whether there is anything material to correct. How long? I can't give you an exact date. That makes me uncomfortable. I understand. I thought about it. Contacting the funder myself might have felt decisive. It also would have allowed Caroline to claim I was trying to bypass governance because of a personal conflict. For now, I'll hold, I said. But I want that reflected in the record. I am agreeing not to contact them while the board verifies the submitted version. I am not waiving the issue. Elaine wrote something down. It will be reflected, she said. One more thing. Evelyn waited. Please don't use "she was informally involved" as a substitute for identifying the actual activity. If I attended a fundraiser, call it attendance. If I edited a paragraph, call it editing. If I spoke on a panel, name the panel. That's very specific. So is an advisor title. The meeting ended at 11:12. At 11:17, Caroline emailed the extended family again. I didn't need to open it to know what she wanted the story to become. I opened it anyway. This time she emphasized that the review had begun only after a private holiday dispute, and warned that year-end giving could suffer because of personal emotions being introduced into mission work. A cousin replied that everyone should calm down. An aunt wrote that sisters sometimes said things they regretted. Someone else asked whether we could all meet before Christmas. Nobody asked why. A grant application submitted 9 days before Thanksgiving listed me in a role I had already objected to. That afternoon, I added Caroline's email to the chronology. Claim: review caused by Thanksgiving. Contradicting record. Written withdrawal. September 3rd. The spreadsheet did not care how many relatives believed her. Tuesday morning, Dad texted. Coffee. No bored people. Just us. For several minutes, my thumb rested above the screen. 14 months earlier, I would have gone to his office. That was his territory. His desk. His foundation plaques. His photographs. His version of the past hanging on every wall. Instead, I sent the name of a coffee shop halfway between my apartment and the foundation. Tomorrow. 7:30. 30 minutes. He arrived before me. Richard Grant had always dressed like a man who believed seriousness could be tailored. Navy coat, gray scarf, leather gloves placed neatly beside his coffee. No papers on the table. That was intentional, I assumed, though I couldn't know why. I sat across from him. You look tired, he said. I'm fine. Your mother hasn't slept. That's unfortunate. His mouth tightened. Olivia. Dad. For a while, neither of us touched the coffee. Then he said, "This has gotten bigger than it needed to." Which part? You know which part. I'd rather not guess. A familiar crease appeared between his eyebrows. "We'll reimburse the Thanksgiving expense." That surprised me enough that I let him continue. "All of it," he said. "You shouldn't have carried that alone." I agreed to the contract. "You did. We should have helped." "Okay. We'll also remove your photograph from the website and current campaign materials." "That's already paused. Permanently. If that's what you want." He spoke as though he were laying pieces carefully on a table. "And Caroline will apologize to you privately." "For what?" His fingers closed around the coffee cup. "For what she said." "What did she say?" His eyes lifted to mine. The question hung there. He knew. I knew he knew. But naming it would have forced the conversation into a place he had spent years avoiding. "Finally," he said, "the comment about your adoption. That's a generous description." He ignored that. "In return, I want you to let governance correct the wording internally and stop widening the review." There it was. Not money for silence. Something more sophisticated. Money, apology, cleanup, dignity preserved for everyone. A reasonable package, if the problem had been Thanksgiving. What exactly would they correct? I asked. The role language. Was the November 17th application submitted with inaccurate role language? We're determining that. Then how do you know what should be corrected? His stare held mine. "You're doing that thing you do." "What thing?" Turning a conversation into an audit. I looked down at my coffee. "For 22 years, people in this family have told me my story matters. Apparently it matters enough to put in donor decks, annual reports, speeches, and grant applications. The moment I ask what was actually authorized, that becomes an audit? You know what I mean." "I do." His face changed slightly, but I kept going. "If you want to reimburse Thanksgiving, reimburse Thanksgiving. That was a personal contract. It doesn't purchase a different answer about a submitted grant record." "It's not purchasing anything." "Then don't tie them together. We are trying to keep a good organization from being damaged over language that can be fixed." "Then fix it." "That's what I'm asking." "No, you're asking me to stop the review after it's fixed quietly." A man at the next table laughed at something on his phone. Dad lowered his voice. "Your story is why people believed in this foundation in the first place." The sentence landed more softly than Caroline's insult. It did more damage. Not because he meant to hurt me, because he seemed to think it explained everything. My story, not my consent. Not my participation. Not my role. My story. An asset that had performed well for 20 years. I pushed my untouched coffee slightly away. "You just made my point for me." His expression hardened. "No, I didn't. You think because my adoption inspired the foundation has continuing rights to use it. I think this organization was built around what our family learned from becoming your family. Those aren't the same thing. Olivia, nobody is exploiting you." "Then the records will show that." "You're willing to put staff and programs through this to prove a technical point." "No. I'm willing to let an independent board verify a submitted statement. You know how donors react to uncertainty." And Caroline knew the difference between September and November. That stopped him. Only for a second, but it stopped him. I stood. "We're at 30 minutes. Sit down." "No. Olivia, if you want to repay dinner, send it without conditions. If you want to discuss the foundation, put it in writing. You don't talk to your father through formal channels." "About my childhood?" "No." I pulled on my coat. "About a grant application that uses my professional identity? We do now." The refund arrived 2 days later. $29,684.12. No memo beyond Thanksgiving reimbursement. I left it untouched in my account. Accepting repayment for a dinner I had already paid did not obligate me to sell anything in return. That afternoon, Elaine sent a secure notice. Governance had approved limited access to archived board materials necessary to verify the provenance of the Foundation's public origin story and attribution language. I opened the first packet after work. The memo was old, nearly 2 decades. Richard had written it when the Foundation was still small enough that meeting notes looked more like family correspondence than institutional records. One line described my adoption as the emotional foundation of our public mission. I sat very still. Not because the phrase was sinister. At the time, it probably hadn't been. Then I opened a later collaborative draft. Comments appeared in the margin from several users. One carried Dad's initials. Keep Olivia in the narrative. Donors recognize the origin story. No mention of a grant. No mention of Caroline. No indication that he anticipated my September withdrawal years later. By itself, the comment proved almost nothing. That was precisely why it mattered. He had not hidden it because he had never considered it something that required hiding. My childhood was part of the organization's narrative architecture. A familiar piece of branding. Something that could be carried forward because it had always been carried forward. Caroline had not invented that assumption. She had inherited it. I leaned back from the screen and stared across my apartment. For years, I had imagined the foundation beginning with a moment of gratitude. Richard and Margaret adopted a little girl, saw how complicated the system could be, and decided to help other families. That version might even have been true. What I had never considered was the point at which gratitude became ownership. My inbox chimed. Another archived file had been released. This one contained tracked revisions from the current renewal cycle. I opened the version list. The line describing me had changed 3 times. Family inspiration. Then, informal lived experience resource. Then, in the final revision before submission, lived experience advisor, Olivia Grant. The change had been made after September 3rd, after I had withdrawn consent, after Caroline had acknowledged the email. My cursor hovered over the revision details. Caroline might have inherited the story. Richard might have taught everyone that keeping me in the narrative was normal. Neither fact answered the question that mattered now. Someone had taken a woman who had asked to step out and written her back in with a more official title. I needed to know who changed that line. And who knew before it left the building. The question of who changed that line was answered 3 days later. But not in the way I expected. Governance scheduled the meeting for 9 on a Thursday morning. Elaine sent the invitation with a neutral subject line and a list of documents attached for reference. Caroline would attend. Dad would attend as treasurer. Evelyn would chair. Mom was not invited. That alone changed the temperature. At 8:57, Caroline joined the video call from her foundation office. Dad appeared beside her a minute later from another conference room. Neither acknowledged me beyond a brief hello. Evelyn began. This meeting is for factual verification. It is not a disciplinary hearing, and no findings have been made. Caroline nodded. So everyone understands, Evelyn continued. The issue under review is whether the Foundation's description of Olivia Grant in the November renewal application accurately reflected her role at the time of submission. Caroline spoke first. I think we need to start with context. Go ahead, Evelyn said. My sister had prepared well. That mattered. She didn't deny that I had withdrawn permission for future public-facing use of my photograph. She didn't pretend the September email did not exist. Instead, she built her argument from facts that were true. Olivia has supported this organization for years, she said. She's reviewed donor materials. She's spoken publicly about adoption. She's attended events, answered questions from program staff, and helped shape language around lived experience. Nobody invented her involvement in November. Dad added, We've never operated like a large university or hospital. A lot of participation grew organically. We're a small nonprofit with long-standing relationships. Caroline continued, the term advisor was meant broadly. It wasn't meant to imply that she was an employee or voting member of a formal committee. Evelyn glanced at me. Olivia. The application didn't say broadly. Caroline's mouth tightened. I kept my eyes on the document in front of me. It said, Lived Experience Advisor, Olivia Grant. If the foundation means occasional speaker, say occasional speaker. If it means volunteer reviewer, say volunteer reviewer. If it means someone who once answered questions about language, describe that. Caroline leaned forward. You're ignoring years of participation because of one dinner. There it was. Not shouted. Not dramatic. Just placed carefully, where everyone could hear it. Evelyn intervened before I could respond. Caroline, stay with the record. I am staying with the record. The review accelerated immediately after Thanksgiving. That's true, I said. Caroline looked toward my square on the screen. So you admit it. The review accelerated after Thanksgiving. My written withdrawal did not. Elaine's fingers moved across her keyboard. I opened the chronology I had prepared. February. I approved one photograph for the spring campaign only. May. That campaign ended. September 3rd. I withdrew authorization for future public-facing use and specifically objected to being described as an advisor without a written agreement. September 8th. Caroline acknowledged that email. October. The board minutes noted that I wanted to step back from public-facing use. November 17th. The renewal application was submitted. Thanksgiving was November 26th. Nobody interrupted. The dinner can explain why I stopped waiting, I said. It cannot explain a document submitted 9 days earlier. Dad shifted in his chair. Our position is that the advisory description reflected long-standing involvement, regardless of the marketing withdrawal. Then the dates should settle it. Evelyn looked from him to me. What do you mean? If they believe the September email only covered photographs and marketing, the record should show why. If they believe I remained an advisor, there should be something showing what that role required and that I knew I still held it. Caroline gave a short exhale. This is exactly what I mean. You're applying institutional language to a relationship that was never institutional. The moment my name went into a grant application, the relationship became institutional. Elaine stopped typing again. Caroline looked away. The meeting lasted another 40 minutes. No one confessed. No one collapsed. No one told me I had won. By the time it ended, Evelyn had requested the exact September correspondence, proof of receipt, the revision history for the renewal narrative, and any documentation supporting the advisor designation. For the first time since Thanksgiving, the argument had moved somewhere my parents could not settle by deciding whose feelings counted. That should have felt like progress. Instead, an hour later, Evelyn called me privately. I want to discuss what happens next. Her tone told me before her words did. The board's current preference is to correct the attribution internally, remove the biography from future materials, and obtain external advice before deciding whether the funder needs to be notified. I stood beside my kitchen window with the phone against my ear. So no notice yet. Not yet. And Caroline? Remains executive director while the review continues. Despite the September email, despite the fact that there is a dispute, we have not established materiality. The word irritated me because it was the right word. A sloppy description was not automatically a material grant misstatement. That distinction was exactly the kind of distinction I defended at work. What would an internal correction accomplish? I asked. It would stop future use and clean up the record. It wouldn't correct the submitted version. No. Would the funder know the person identified as advisor disputes ever having that role? Not at this stage. I rubbed the edge of the window frame with my thumb. Evelyn continued. You need to consider proportionality, Olivia. A formal disclosure can create donor questions, funding delays, legal costs, staff anxiety. We are talking about a role description, not proof that funds were stolen. I know. Do you? Yes. The answer came out sharper than I intended. A few seconds passed. Then Evelyn said, I'm not minimizing your concern. I'm telling you why the board isn't prepared to treat your interpretation as settled. That was the false comfort of having competent people in the room. They did not automatically agree with me. They made me prove it. What would you need? I asked. To determine whether correction is required externally? We need the final submitted language, how it got there, whether it affected the funder's evaluation, what the grant required regarding key advisors, and whether anyone with notice of your objection had a chance to correct it before submission. That last phrase stayed with me. With notice, had a chance to correct. I wrote it down after we hung up. Then I closed the foundation folder. For the rest of that evening, I did something I had postponed for months. My own life. The Thanksgiving reimbursement still sat untouched in checking. I moved most of it into savings and reset an automatic transfer from every paycheck. The number on the screen wasn't where it had been before the dinner, but it was moving in the right direction again. Next came my lease. The renewal email had been sitting unanswered for 11 days. For months, I had kept a small part of myself prepared to leave Boston if the situation became unbearable. Another part had kept the possibility of returning to my parents' house in some abstract emergency, even though every important document I owned had already been moved out. That possibility had stopped being practical long before I admitted it was emotional. I signed the 1-year renewal. The click was almost disappointingly ordinary. No music. No declaration. Just my name under a place nobody else controlled. Then I opened my professional development calendar. A certification workshop I had postponed twice sat in February. The first time, Mom had needed help with a donor dinner. The second, Caroline had asked me to review year-end language. I registered before anyone could manufacture a third emergency. A recurring calendar reminder caught my eye next. Mom Foundation dinner prep. Every second Tuesday. I stared at it long enough to remember how it started. One event, then another, then an assumption. Delete. In its place, I blocked Tuesday evenings. No title. No explanation. Time didn't need to be productive to belong to me. 2 days later, Leah Morgan asked if she could speak with me. Leah managed one of the Foundation's family support programs. We had met often enough at events that she had my number, but she had never been part of the private grant orbit. We met at a cafe near the hospital during my lunch break. She wrapped both hands around a paper cup. "I'm not here to ask you to drop anything." "Okay, I want to say that first." "Thank you." She looked exhausted. "We've heard there may be a grant review." "Who told you?" "Nobody officially. Budget managers were asked to model what happens if a January disbursement is delayed. That was information I had not known." "What program exposure are you looking at?" "Our parent navigation work is the biggest concern. Payroll's covered for a while, but some contracted services would tighten quickly." "Do you have unrestricted funds available?" "Some." "How long?" "Depends what leadership preserves." The answer bothered me more than a plea would have. Leah wasn't asking me to sacrifice myself. She was describing consequences. People with no relationship to Caroline's choices might spend January wondering whether their jobs existed in February. For a moment, Mom's argument from the family email came back to me. People depend on us. The difference was that Leah hadn't weaponized them. She simply existed in the same system. "I can't promise there won't be disruption," I said. "I know. If the board asks for my input on corrective options, I'll push for something targeted. Program continuity where it can be protected. Governance consequences where they belong." Her eyebrows lifted. "You're willing to help with that?" "I'm willing to keep staff from becoming collateral if there's a lawful way to do it." "And Caroline?" "That's not the same question." Leah nodded slowly. "No, it isn't." After she left, I sat with my coffee for another 5 minutes. The easier version of revenge would have been cleaner emotionally. Expose them. Watch everything burn. Call the fire justice. Real systems didn't work like that. If the Foundation had done good work, that work did not become worthless because Caroline had abused her authority. If employees were decent, they did not deserve to lose income so I could feel decisive. The target had to stay narrow. The next evening, Mom appeared outside my apartment. No call, no text. Just 3 knocks on my door. Through the peephole, I saw her standing in the hallway with her purse over one shoulder and a bakery box in both hands. The sight of that box almost made me laugh. Margaret brought food when she wanted a conversation to feel less like an ambush. I opened the door only as far as the chain allowed. Her eyes dropped to it. "You're serious? You didn't call. I'm your mother." "That doesn't answer what I said." She shifted the box against her hip. "Can I come in?" "No." The word surprised both of us less than it would have once. Mom glanced down the hallway. "Olivia, I'm not doing this in front of your neighbors." "Then we don't have to do it." Her mouth pressed into a line. "Your father says the board is considering outside review." "Yes. You can end this with one email." "No. People could lose funding." "I know. Employees could lose jobs." "I know that too." "Then, how can you stand there acting like this is just paperwork?" My fingers rested against the inside edge of the door. "Why are you asking me to retract, instead of asking Caroline to correct the record?" "She has explained what happened. She has defended what happened. She says your involvement was always broader than you're pretending now. Then an independent review should confirm that." Mom's voice dropped. After everything we gave you, I never thought you'd be willing to humiliate us like this. There it was. The phrase that had survived every version of my childhood. After everything we gave you. A bedroom. A last name. School clothes. Birthday cakes. College help. Things parents gave children. Transformed into a line of credit that apparently accumulated interest forever. At 20, that sentence could make me abandon an argument before it began. At 28, standing behind a door only I could unlock, it sounded smaller. This isn't about whether you adopted me, I said. It is when you're trying to destroy what came from that adoption. I'm asking for a role description to be accurate. You know it's bigger than that. Yes. She stared at me. For once, I didn't rush to soften the answer. The bigger part is that you want the story of adopting me to belong to you more than you want my consent to matter inside it. Mom's face changed, but I could not tell whether it was anger or hurt. I didn't need to decide. That is an awful thing to say. It would be worse if it weren't supported by 20 years of brochures. She flinched. The bakery box lowered slightly. Christmas is in 3 weeks. I know. Are you really going to do this to everyone through Christmas? The review has nothing to do with Christmas. Everything has to do with the family. That's exactly the problem. She looked past me into the apartment. My apartment. Not the room they gave me. Not a place where Richard's name sat on the deed or Margaret's key worked in the lock. Mine. If you want to see me, I said, call first. Don't come here unannounced again. Her eyes returned to mine. You're setting rules for your mother now? For my home. Mom stood there another few seconds. Then she held out the bakery box. I brought your favorite. I looked at it. Take it with you. That hurt more than refusing the conversation. I could tell from the way she pulled it back against her chest. But letting her leave a peace offering inside my kitchen would have turned the evening into something else by morning. A visit, a softening, evidence that we were working things out. We weren't. She left without saying goodbye. The elevator doors closed behind her. Only then did I shut my door. My hand stayed on the deadbolt after it clicked. A boundary was less dramatic from the inside. No audience. No applause. Just a lock turning once. The following Monday, Elaine sent me a secure link to the chronology request governance had issued to Caroline. They wanted a written response to one question: whether the November renewal application required correction in light of my September withdrawal and dispute of the advisor designation. I already had my own chronology open. February. Limited permission. May. Spring campaign ended. September 3rd. Withdrawal. September 8th. Caroline acknowledged. October. Board note. November 17th. Submission. November 26th. Thanksgiving. Dates did not care that Caroline could make a room like her. They did not care that Dad had founded the organization. They did not care that Mom could make a boundary sound like ingratitude. Later that afternoon, Elaine notified me that Caroline's written response had been added to the governance record. I opened it. The document was only a page and a half. Most of it repeated the same argument she had made in the meeting: long-standing participation, informal contribution, broad understanding of my role. Then came the sentence that changed the case. Nothing in the application is materially false. Olivia's advisory role has always been understood broadly, regardless of whether she participated in every formal meeting. My eyes stayed on the word materially. Not false, not misunderstood. Materially false. Caroline had been asked a direct governance question after receiving notice that I disputed the role. She had been given a chance to correct it. She had chosen to defend it instead. I downloaded the response exactly as provided and saved the original in a read-only folder. Then I updated the chronology one last time. Formal notice of disputed role. Opportunity to correct. Written refusal. No one had confessed to exploiting me. I no longer needed them to. The evidence had reached the point my father had spent years assuming it never would. The point where their intention mattered less than the choice they made after being told the record was wrong. That evening, I wrote Evelyn. Not Caroline. Not Dad. Not Mom. I am requesting an external materiality review of the submitted renewal application and the Foundation's obligation, if any, to correct the record with the funder. I will provide the chronology and source documents requested. I am not asking for suspension of program services beyond what the governing. My cursor hovered over send. For 14 months, I had told myself I was waiting until everything was airtight. Until nobody could call me emotional. Until every explanation was eliminated. Until every person who might suffer had a guaranteed landing place. That standard had kept me careful. It had also kept me waiting. Carolyn had just given me what I had actually needed. Not a confession. A record showing she had been notified, given the chance to fix the problem, and had chosen not to. I pressed send. The external review request went out at 9:17 that night. By 9:22, there was nothing left for me to do except wait for people who did not share my last name to decide whether the distinction I had spent months documenting actually mattered. Waiting had never been my strongest skill. At work, waiting usually meant something measurable: a missing certification, a principal investigator's response, a sponsor clarification. There was a date beside the delay, and a person responsible for answering it. This was different. The next morning, Elaine sent a secure message saying the governance committee had authorized release of the documents necessary for the independent review. No interpretation, just records. That helped. At my desk after work, I opened a new file and built 5 columns: claim, source, contradiction, authority, consequence. The first row was simple. Claim: Olivia Grant served as a lived experience advisor. Source: November 17th renewal application. Contradiction: no appointment, no defined advisory scope, no advisory meeting record, written September objection to implied advisory affiliation. Authority: final submitted application. Consequence: disputed role appears in an external funding request. The second row addressed consent. The third tracked the evolution of the language. The fourth covered notice. The fifth covered Caroline's refusal to correct after notice. Elaine did not build the map for me. She supplied what the governance committee had authorized me to see: the final application, the board packet, the relevant minutes, and an exported revision log. Every file arrived with a source label. Every version had a date. No private server access. No password someone forgot to revoke. No miraculous folder appearing on a desk. Just records that already existed inside a process Caroline had assumed would remain under her control. The final submitted application bothered me most because it removed the last easy escape. The phrase was not sitting in a draft. Not in notes. Not in a brainstorm. It had left the building. Lived experience advisor. Olivia Grant. Below my name, the narrative described the Foundation's program design as informed by ongoing lived experience consultation. My name was positioned close enough to that language that a reader could reasonably connect the two. I highlighted nothing. Instead, in the consequence column, I wrote, requires independent assessment of whether role representation was relevant to sponsor evaluation or grant terms. That was all I could responsibly say. The next afternoon, Dad asked to meet again. This time, I refused coffee. Put it in writing. I told him over the phone. This is not a Foundation conversation. If it involves the review, it is. It involves you and me. Then say what you need to say. A pause followed. You've become very comfortable putting walls around everything. The sentence would once have sent me into an explanation about why walls were necessary. Instead, I waited. Finally, he said, your mother wants this resolved before Christmas. That isn't a governance deadline. Olivia, what are you asking? He exhaled through his nose. Caroline will agree that future applications should use a different title. Your image stays out. Your biography stays out. You have the Thanksgiving money back. We move forward. And the November application? It gets corrected internally. Does the funder get notified? That depends on whether notification is actually required. That's what the external review is supposed to determine. His voice hardened. We don't need an outsider deciding whether one line of language destroys everything we built. There it was again. Everything we built. As if the review itself were the dangerous thing. What exactly are you afraid will be destroyed? I asked. Trust. With whom? Donors, staff, partners, people who have supported us for years. Then accurate records should matter to them. You can't be this naive. The insult almost made me smile. Not because it amused me. Because I had spent years being called calculating whenever I asked for details, and naive whenever details became inconvenient. Dad continued. Disclosures create questions. Questions delay decisions. Delays hurt programs. You know that. I do. Then protect the organization first. The word protect sat between us. For years, that had been my assigned verb. Protect Caroline from embarrassment. Protect Mom from stress. Protect Dad's reputation. Protect Thanksgiving. Protect donors from uncomfortable details. Protect the institution from the consequences of the people running it. What happens to Caroline? I asked. If the wording should have been different, she corrects it. And her authority? That is not your decision. No, it isn't. He seemed to relax slightly. Then let the board handle personnel and stop pushing for disclosure. That's still asking me to make a personnel outcome possible by narrowing the record. You are twisting this. No. I'm separating it. I looked at the Thanksgiving reimbursement, still sitting in savings. You already repaid the dinner. That was a personal matter. It doesn't buy silence about a submitted application. Nobody said it did. You just listed it as one of the reasons we should move forward. He said nothing. That was enough. I won't withdraw the review request. Then you should understand there may not be a relationship left when this is over. The words did not surprise me. They still found the old place. A pressure point 22 years deep. For a second, 6-year-old me existed alongside the woman standing in her own kitchen. The child who learned early that belonging could sound like a privilege someone else had granted. My grip tightened around the phone, then loosened. If the relationship requires me to change an institutional record so you'll keep being my father, I said. You've already answered the question. He hung up first. That evening, Mom texted one sentence. I hope being right is worth what this is costing you. No answer felt more accurate than none. So I gave her none. 2 days later, Evelyn asked me to join a short governance call. Elaine was already there. We're bringing in an external nonprofit compliance consultant, Evelyn said. Dana Brooks. She has no prior relationship with the foundation. Okay. There's another issue. I waited. The board has discussed whether you should participate in the corrective work as a temporary observer or lived experience representative. For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. Elaine shifted slightly in her chair. Evelyn continued. The thinking is that your participation could demonstrate that the board is addressing both governance and stakeholder voice in good faith. There it was in a new suit. A nicer chair, a more respectful invitation. The same instinct. Use Olivia to prove what kind of organization we are. No, I said. Evelyn blinked. No, to which part? The role. You wouldn't be expected to carry operational responsibility. That's not the issue. Then help me understand. If you need factual answers from me, ask. If you need me to verify statements about my own involvement, send them. I'll cooperate. And the observer seat? No. Evelyn folded her hands. It could give you direct visibility. I already asked for direct accuracy. This is not meant as branding. Maybe not. But it would become branding the second somebody said the person at the center of the dispute had joined the correction effort. Elaine looked down, then back up. I continued. I'm not fighting to become the right kind of advisor. I'm saying I was never one. The room on my laptop stayed still. Then Evelyn nodded. Fair. One more boundary, I said. No public statement describing me as participating in reform unless I approve that exact statement. That's specific. It needs to be. Elaine typed it into the record. Facts, yes. A. New symbolic role, no. For the first time since the review began, refusing something offered by people who were not hurting me felt almost as important as refusing my parents. A boundary was not only a weapon aimed outward, it had to remain mine even when the person on the other side meant well. Dana Brooks joined the process the following Monday. She had the kind of manner that made every answer feel temporarily insufficient. Our first session lasted nearly 2 hours. She began with the grant terms, not my childhood. Walk me through the chronology without Thanksgiving, she said. That instruction made me trust her more. February, I began. Single photograph approved for spring campaign only. She interrupted. Do you have the exact language? Yes. Read it. I did. Next. May. Campaign ended. Evidence? Archived campaign schedule. Next. September 3rd. Withdrawal of future public-facing consent and objection to advisory attribution without written agreement. Receipt? September 8th. Acknowledgement from Caroline. Next. October board minutes note my request to step back from public-facing use. Next. November 17th. Renewal submitted identifying me as lived experience advisor. Dana looked at the application. Was the advisor role part of the scored program design? I don't know. Good. The answer caught me off guard. She glanced up. Don't fill gaps for me. I wasn't planning to. Everybody plans not to until they care about the outcome. Point taken. For the next hour, Dana separated things I had spent weeks stacking together. The website language might be misleading without being material to the grant. The photograph might violate consent scope without affecting sponsor evaluation. The role description might be inaccurate without automatically amounting to fraud. The question was narrower. Did the application rely on lived experience participation as part of program credibility or design, and did the sponsor's terms require correction if a material representation was inaccurate? Dana requested the scoring narrative and grant conditions. Evelyn authorized them. When the documents arrived, we went line by line. The answer appeared not in a dramatic paragraph but in a scoring rubric. Community-informed program design carried weight. The application represented that the foundation used continuing lived experience input. My listed role sat inside that section. Dana read the page twice. Then she turned to the grant condition requiring timely correction of material inaccuracies discovered after submission. This cannot be fixed by changing the website, she said. Nobody spoke. She continued. The submitted record requires a corrective disclosure under the grant terms. Caroline was not on the call. Neither was Dad. There was no reaction to watch. Only the sentence I had been waiting 14 months to hear from someone whose job was not to love me. Not that Caroline was evil. Not that I had suffered enough. Not that Thanksgiving had been humiliating. Only that the record required correction. I wrote the wording down exactly. Dana added, That does not mean I am making a finding of fraud. I am not. Intent is a separate question, and even material inaccuracy does not answer it by itself. Understood, I said. The next question is how the language reached final submission after your September notice. That answer arrived in the revision log. Elaine and Dana sat with me in a secure conference call while we reviewed the relevant sequence. An earlier draft described me as a founding inspiration. The next called me an informal lived experience resource. After September 3rd, the wording changed again. Lived experience advisor, Olivia Grant. The user attached to the revision was Caroline. My skin prickled, but I said nothing. A revision proved authorship of a change. It did not prove motive. Then Elaine opened the corresponding email chain. Caroline had asked a program staff member to finalize the narrative before the submission deadline. The staff member replied, Do we need Olivia to reconfirm how we're describing her? Her September note sounded like she wanted to step back. Caroline's response was one sentence. Don't reopen that with Olivia before submission. We're on deadline. The room seemed to shrink around my laptop. Dana asked Elaine. Is this archive complete for that thread? Yes. Any later message showing confirmation was obtained? None in the preserved record. My eyes stayed on Caroline's sentence. It wasn't a confession. She did not write, Olivia will hate this, do it anyway. She did not admit deception. She did something more ordinary. She recognized a question. She postponed the person whose answer might complicate the deadline, then submitted. Dana moved to the next document. Dad's old comment appeared in an archived planning draft. Keep Olivia in the narrative. Donors recognize the origin story. The sentence had bothered me since I first saw it. Dana barely paused. This establishes historical pressure to retain the origin narrative, she said. It does not establish that Richard authored the later advisor language. Agreed. No stretching. No, making one ugly sentence prove 5 things. That restraint strengthened everything else. Finally came Caroline's response from the previous week. Nothing in the application is materially false. Dana placed the documents in sequence. September notice. Later roll inflation. Internal question about reconfirmation. Instruction not to reopen with me. Submission. Formal notice of dispute. Refusal to correct. The pattern no longer depended on whether anyone believed Caroline had meant to hurt me. She had been given more than one point at which to stop. She had chosen forward each time. The formal governance meeting was scheduled for Friday. 9 people appeared on the call. Evelyn, Elaine, Donna, 5 board members, Caroline, Dad, and me. Margaret was not included. Evelyn opened with process. Caroline spoke before I did. Her defense was better than anything Mom could have invented. She acknowledged my September email but argued that it concerned future public-facing marketing and did not erase years of informal program contribution. She pointed out that I had attended events, reviewed language, spoken with donors, and never previously demanded removal from every internal description. No money was taken by Olivia, she said. No advisory stipend was claimed. There was no fabricated employee. This was an informal role described in good faith based on long-standing participation. One board member asked, "Why didn't you reconfirm after the staff question?" We were approaching deadline. I believed the existing history supported the description. Why use advisor rather than supporter? Because Olivia had advised us, another member asked. After she formally disputed the designation, why did you write that nothing was materially false instead of agreeing to correct pending review? Caroline's answer came quickly. Because I believed then, and still believe, that the description was substantively fair. Dad went next. He spoke about the Foundation's history, programs, staff, donors, and the consequences of turning a wording dispute into a sponsor disclosure. Nothing he said was absurd. That made it harder. Programs could be delayed. Donors could ask questions. Staff could worry. Legacy was not imaginary just because he used it as leverage. Then Evelyn asked me to speak. The statement in front of me was 6 pages long. I used less than one. "I'm not asking the board to decide whether I helped this foundation," I said. "I did." Caroline looked toward me. "I'm not asking you to erase every event I attended or every document I reviewed. I'm asking you to correct one specific representation in a submitted application." A board member asked, "What action are you requesting?" I read the 4 points I had written myself. Correct the description of my role. Notify the funder in the manner required by the grant terms. Recuse individuals whose actions are under review from approving the correction. And install independent interim sign-off so current programs do not depend on the same approval chain while this is resolved. Dad leaned toward his microphone. "You're asking to suspend the people who built the organization." "No, I'm asking the board to separate the people being reviewed from the process reviewing them." Dana presented her finding next. No dramatic language. The advisor representation sat within a scored section concerning community-informed program design. The sponsor terms required correction of material inaccuracies. The correction should therefore go to the funder. Elaine walked the board through the record. No appointment. Limited consent. September withdrawal. October minute. Role change after notice. Deadline email. Final submission. Later refusal to correct. Nobody gasped. One board member asked whether program operations could continue during a correction. Dana said yes, assuming the funder did not direct otherwise, if interim controls were put in place. Another asked whether Caroline had sole authority over grant submissions. Elaine explained the current approval structure. A third asked whether Dad, as treasurer, had reviewed the final packet. The record showed that he had access to it, but did not establish that he authored the disputed revision. That distinction remained. It mattered. Then Evelyn called for the votes. Caroline was placed on administrative leave pending completion of the broader governance review. Dad was recused from treasurer duties related to the matter and suspended from approval authority during the review. The corrective packet would be sent to the funder. Independent interim sign-off would take effect immediately. Programs would remain operating unless the sponsor instructed otherwise. The votes were not unanimous. That mattered too. This wasn't a room full of people deciding the grants were monsters. It was an institution finally deciding that the grants could not grade their own work. Caroline's camera stayed on. Dad's did too. Neither spoke after the vote. For years, they had controlled the language before anyone else saw it. Now the record would leave without their approval. That was the reversal. Not me taking Caroline's office. Not Dad begging. Not Margaret apologizing. Power had moved somewhere they could not reach by calling me ungrateful. After the meeting, Evelyn asked me to remain for 1 minute. The correction goes out Monday. Okay. The funder may contact you directly. I understand. You know this can still become uncomfortable. It already is. She almost smiled, then didn't. Elaine will send you the final factual statement for signature. The document arrived 20 minutes later. My name sat at the bottom. Not inside somebody else's biography. Not under a title I had never accepted. Below facts I had chosen to verify. Before signing, I read every line. Once. Twice. On the third pass, I removed one adjective that felt unnecessary. Then I signed. The next morning, a secure message arrived from the funder. 3 questions were listed. The first 2 concerned appointment records and approval of the role description. The third was shorter. Did you ever serve in the advisory role described in the November 17th renewal application? For 14 months, I had been preparing for the day my parents could no longer answer for me. Now the question had finally reached the only person who should have been asked in the first place. The funder's third question stayed on my screen longer than the other 2. Did you ever serve in the advisory role described in the November 17th renewal application? There were a dozen emotionally satisfying ways to answer it. None belonged in the record. My fingers settled over the keyboard. No. I participated in limited volunteer activities over several years, including attending fundraising events, reviewing selected language, and speaking about my personal adoption experience. I was never appointed to, nor did I knowingly accept, the continuing advisory role described in the renewal application. I objected in writing to implied advisory affiliation on September 3rd, before the application was submitted. I read it twice, then added one more sentence. Supporting correspondence has been provided through the Foundation's governance process. Send. That was all. No Thanksgiving. No plate. No adopted girl. No photograph of me with missing front teeth beneath a slogan about love. The institutional question had finally become narrow enough that the answer could be narrow too. 3 days later, the funder acknowledged receipt of the corrective disclosure and temporarily paused the next scheduled disbursement while it reviewed the amended program narrative. The pause was not a cancellation. That distinction became the center of every conversation that followed. Leah called me during lunch. Can you talk? For a few minutes. We got the notice. How bad? Manageable if it's short. Her voice sounded tired, but not panicked. Leadership approved use of unrestricted reserves for payroll and essential contracted services. We're postponing 2 expansion items. Parent navigation? Still running. Some pressure left my shoulders. Good. There's something else, Leah said. What? The staff were told not to contact you about the review. I straightened. Who told you that? The interim director. It wasn't framed as a threat, more like protecting the process. That makes sense. I know. I just didn't want you to hear later and think people were avoiding you. The fact that she bothered to explain touched a place I had not expected. Thank you. She hesitated. Olivia. Yes? Whatever happens with Caroline, I'm glad the programs aren't being used as leverage. Neither of us said who had been using them that way. We did not need to. After the call, the hospital cafeteria moved around me as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Trays slid along counters. Someone dropped a fork. A resident argued with a vending machine. For months, the Foundation had occupied the same part of my mind that a smoke detector occupied during an alarm. Impossible to ignore. Now, for the first time, I could imagine the sound stopping without the entire building burning down. That mattered. The point had never been destruction. The point was that the people who controlled the organization should no longer be allowed to use its good work as insulation from accountability. The funder responded formally 11 days later. Elaine sent the letter through the secure portal. I opened it after work at my dining table. The Foundation would retain the grant. Future disbursements would resume after acceptance of a corrective action plan. The funder required revised program documentation, clearer designation of advisory roles, documented consent where personal experience was used as evidence of stakeholder participation, and enhanced approval controls for future submissions. No criminal referral, no dramatic demand for millions of dollars. No announcement that every good thing the organization had ever done was fraudulent. One specific representation had been materially inaccurate. The sponsor wanted it corrected and wanted controls strong enough to reduce the chance of repetition. The relief came first. Then, something quieter. Disappointment. Not because the consequences were too small. Because a part of me had spent so long preparing for combat that an orderly correction felt almost anticlimactic. I had imagined this ending in fragments for 14 months. Caroline cornered by an impossible question. Dad finally forced to admit he had treated my life like institutional property. Mom, standing in a room where nobody believed her version anymore. Reality gave me governance minutes instead. A corrective action plan. A temporary funding pause. An independent review. And those things were enough. That realization felt more important than any punishment could have. Evelyn scheduled the final governance session for the following Thursday. This time, I attended only for the portion concerning my records. Caroline remained on administrative leave. Dad's approval authority was still suspended. Dana had completed her review. The conclusions were specific. The foundation had developed a long-standing practice of using informal relationships without clearly separating personal participation from institutional roles. That weakness had created room for Caroline to describe me more formally than the evidence supported. The September withdrawal should have triggered explicit reconfirmation before submission. It had not. The internal email telling staff not to reopen the question with me established that Caroline knew there was uncertainty and chose not to resolve it before deadline. Her later written refusal to correct, after formal notice, turned a preventable documentation problem into a governance problem. Dad's role was different. The review did not find evidence that he wrote the disputed advisor language. It did find that, as treasurer and co-founder, he had helped normalize the use of my adoption story as part of the foundation's identity and had failed to insist on clearer boundaries between personal narrative and institutional authorization. He had also supported keeping the correction internal after the dispute became material. That was enough for the board to act without inventing facts it could not prove. Evelyn read the decisions. Caroline would not return as executive director. Her employment would end under the governance provisions applicable to failure to follow required disclosure and approval processes. Any unsupported reimbursements identified in the broader financial review would be repaid, but the review had not found evidence justifying claims that she had stolen foundation funds. Dad would resign as treasurer and step off the board. He would retain the right, like any private donor, to support the organization financially if he chose, but no governance authority. Mom held no formal office requiring removal. That almost made me smile. Margaret's power had never depended on a title. Her consequences would come from somewhere less measurable. The board adopted independent approval requirements for major grant submissions and created formal consent standards for personal narratives used in fundraising or program representation. A professional interim director would oversee operations while the board conducted a search. Programs would continue. Employees would stay. The funder had accepted the corrective plan. When Evelyn finished, no one asked me how I felt. That was a gift. Caroline was allowed to speak. I disagree with the characterization that I knowingly misrepresented Olivia's involvement, she said. Her voice was controlled. I made decisions under deadline pressure, using years of established practice. I accept that the documentation should have been better. One board member asked, "Do you accept that you were specifically warned to reconfirm with Olivia?" I accept that the question was raised. And that you instructed staff not to reopen it before submission? Yes. Why? Because I believed the existing history was sufficient. The answer had not changed. Neither had the record. Caroline continued. I also think the board is underestimating how much this process was accelerated by a personal conflict. Evelyn looked toward me. You are not required to respond. I know. Caroline's eyes stayed on my square. For months, everyone had treated Thanksgiving like the emotional key to the case. Now that it no longer mattered institutionally, I finally felt free to answer it personally. The dinner mattered to me, I said. Caroline's mouth tightened. It mattered because you told me exactly how you saw me. But the application was already submitted. My September email already existed. Your staff member had already asked whether you needed to reconfirm with me. I stopped there. No speech. No victory lap. If Thanksgiving had never happened, the dates would still be the dates. Caroline looked away first. The board moved on. Dad asked to speak before the session ended. His camera had remained on throughout. I built this organization because bringing Olivia into our home changed the way Margaret and I understood adoption. The old language. Bringing Olivia into our home. As if 6-year-old me were still standing in the foyer with a social worker and one small suitcase, Dad continued. Whatever mistakes were made later, I hope nobody forgets that the work was real. It was, I said. The words came before I had time to consider whether I wanted to give him that much. His eyes returned to the camera. Then I hope one day you can separate the good from what happened between us. That request was harder than Caroline's defense. Because I already had. The programs were good. Some of the staff were excellent. People had been helped. None of those facts required me to restore Richard Grant to the role of father as though nothing else had happened. I can separate them, I said. That's why I didn't ask the board to close the foundation. Something moved across his face. I could not name it. So there's nothing left for us? He asked. The room suddenly felt too public for the question. That isn't a board matter. Evelyn stepped in. We should close the governance session. For once, someone else ending a conversation did not feel like rescue. The decisions had already been made through the record I had forced into the open. What remained belonged to me. Dad emailed the following morning. Not through the foundation. From his personal account. Can we meet when you're ready? No agenda. I left it unanswered for 4 days. Mom sent nothing. Caroline sent nothing. The absence should have felt peaceful. Instead, the first week after the review ended was strangely hollow. For more than a year, so many ordinary decisions had been made around a future confrontation. Save this email. Move that document. Decline this expense. Wait before saying that. Keep enough money. Renew nothing you cannot exit. Do not give them another key. Then the confrontation happened. The board acted. The funder responded. No next file waited for me. On Tuesday evening, I came home and almost opened the old correspondence folder out of habit. Instead, I stopped. The certification workshop began in February. There was pre-reading I had ignored. So I made pasta, put my phone in the bedroom, and spent an hour reading material that had nothing to do with the Grant Family Outreach Foundation. At 9, the realization hit me. Nobody had interrupted. No donor biography. No emergency language review. No mother reminding me that Caroline was overwhelmed. My Tuesday evening had remained mine simply because I had claimed it. That was what rebuilding looked like most nights. Not triumph. Unused hours returning. Money no longer disappearing into someone else's event. An apartment that stayed peaceful after the lock turned. A career decision made without asking whether Christmas dinner would become uncomfortable. 3 weeks after the board decision, Dad asked again to meet. This time, I agreed. Same neutral coffee shop. 30 minutes. He looked older than he had before Thanksgiving. That observation made me uncomfortable because compassion had once been the door through which every boundary escaped. So I let myself notice it, without changing the plan. Dad placed no papers on the table. You were right about the application, he said. The sentence was cleaner than I expected. About the correction being required? Yes. Not everything. Just that. I waited. I should have supported disclosure earlier. Yes. His fingers tightened around the cardboard sleeve of his cup. I was thinking about what the foundation could lose. I know. And not enough about why you had stopped trusting us to handle your story. There were 20 things I could have said. One seemed useful. You still called it our story whenever I asked you to stop using it. He lowered his eyes. After a moment, he said, I thought because the foundation came from what we experienced as a family, it belonged to all of us. That was the problem. Yes. The word barely carried across the table. No argument followed. That should have made forgiveness easy. It didn't. Understanding did not restore trust on command. I don't know what our relationship looks like from here, he said. Neither do I. Do you want one? The question hurt more than I expected, not because the answer was no, because it wasn't. Some part of me still wanted a father. What had changed was my willingness to accept any version offered. I'm not going back to what it was. I understand. No foundation conversations outside formal channels. No asking me to review things because I'm your daughter. No using adoption as leverage when you don't like my answer. He flinched at that one. And Mom doesn't come to my apartment without calling. I heard about that. Good. What about Caroline? That's between Caroline and me. Dad nodded. Would you come for Christmas? No. The answer came easily. His face changed. I thought we were trying. We are. Then why not? Because trying doesn't require me to walk back into the same room a month after all of this and perform normal for everyone. He sat with that. What would you be comfortable with? Coffee again in January. For a man who had once expected access to my time because he was my father, coffee in January probably sounded very small. To me, that was the point. A relationship rebuilt honestly had to fit inside the amount of trust that actually existed, not the amount tradition demanded. Okay, he said. We finished our drinks. No hug, no dramatic reconciliation. Outside, we walked in opposite directions. Mom did not accept the new arrangement as quietly. Her first email after Christmas was 6 paragraphs long. She apologized for not understanding how deeply the dinner affected me, then spent the rest explaining how painful it had been to watch the foundation subjected to scrutiny. The apology asked nothing specific of herself, so I answered only what I could use. If you want contact with me, please do not frame institutional accountability as harm I caused. If you want to apologize for your actions at Thanksgiving or your use of my adoption as an obligation, you can do that directly. I am not discussing the review again. Her next message arrived 2 days later. Shorter. I should not have smiled when Caroline told you to leave the table. I should have stopped it. That was specific. I read it more than once. Then came another sentence. I also understand now that saying, after everything we did for you, made being our daughter sound conditional. My throat tightened. There had been a time when those 2 sentences would have bought immediate forgiveness. I would have driven over, brought flowers, made it easier for her to forgive herself. Instead, I closed the email. The apology could exist without demanding a reward from me. 3 days later, I replied, "Thank you for saying that directly. I'm not ready to resume regular visits. I'll reach out when I am." Nothing more. Caroline's apology arrived almost 2 months later. By then, her name had disappeared from the foundation website. An interim director had taken over. The corrected grant remained active. Leah told me the delayed expansion work had been rescheduled for spring. No one had lost their job because of the disclosure. Caroline wrote, "What I said at Thanksgiving was disgusting. I was angry at you before you even sat down, and I used the one thing I knew would put you beneath me in that room. There isn't a professional excuse for that." I stopped reading for a moment, then continued. "I still believe I thought your informal involvement justified the advisor wording at the time. I also know I chose not to ask because I was afraid you would say no, and we were on deadline. That choice cost me my job. I understand why. No request to forgive. No invitation to lunch. No accusation that I had destroyed her career. Just responsibility mixed with a version of events that did not flatter either of us. For the first time, I could see a possible future in which Caroline and I might speak again without pretending the past had disappeared. Possible was not the same as promised. My response was brief. I appreciate the direct apology. I'm not ready for contact beyond email. Please respect that." She did. Spring arrived slowly. The certification workshop turned into an advanced credential I completed that summer. At work, my supervisor asked whether I wanted to take on more responsibility for complex federal submissions. A year earlier, my first thought would have been whether the schedule conflicted with foundation events. This time, I asked about workload, compensation, and authority. Then I accepted. The raise was not life-changing. That made me like it more. No inheritance. No hidden fortune. No enormous settlement. Just money attached to work I had actually done. My savings recovered. The Thanksgiving reimbursement remained part of it, but it no longer felt like the center of anything. The gray document box stayed on the bottom shelf of my bookcase. I did not throw it away. I also stopped opening it. By the following November, the Grant Family Outreach Foundation had a new executive director, 2 independent board members with compliance backgrounds, and a consent policy detailed enough that the old organization would probably have mocked it as excessive. Their website still described the foundation's origin in adoption advocacy. My name was not there. Neither was my childhood photograph. For the first time, that absence felt accurate. Thanksgiving came again. No historic inn. No 50-person dinner. No $30,000 contract. 6 people came to my apartment. 2 coworkers. A neighbor from downstairs. An old college friend and her wife. Leah joined after finishing dinner with her own parents. My dining table technically seated 4, so we added a folding table to the end. Nothing matched. 1 wine glass came from a different set. The turkey rested 15 minutes longer than planned because I forgot to account for the oven running cool. Nobody cared. Before everyone arrived, I wrote place cards as a joke because my college friend loved anything that made dinner look more formal than it was. The last one was mine, Olivia. That was all. New Grant. No daughter. No adopted daughter. No advisor. Just the name of the person whose chair it was. Later that winter, Leah asked whether I would volunteer twice a month with a small mentoring program unaffiliated with the foundation. Young adults aging out of foster care needed help understanding college grants, employment paperwork, and basic financial documents. The work was narrow. Useful. Nobody wanted my childhood story as admission price, so I said yes. Almost a year after Thanksgiving, I was leaving one of those mentoring sessions when the program coordinator caught me near the door. Olivia, quick question. She held up her phone. We took a few photos tonight for next month's newsletter. You're in one of them. Would you be comfortable if we used it? A year earlier, the question might have made my whole body tense. Instead, I held out my hand. Can I see the release? Of course. She handed me a 1-page form. The language was ordinary. Organization website. Monthly newsletter. Social media. No expiration date. I took her pen. Do you mind if I change one thing? Go ahead. Beside the permission clause, I wrote, valid for this newsletter cycle and related posts through March 31st. Any future use requires renewed permission. The coordinator read it. That works. No sigh. No guilt. No reminder of everything the organization had done for me. No one told me I was making things difficult. She simply initialed the change. Then I signed my name. The photograph itself was nothing special. I was standing beside a folding table, pointing at a scholarship form, while a young woman beside me laughed at something outside the frame. No one looking at it would know what happened to me at Thanksgiving. No one needed to. My story was not valuable because other people could turn it into proof of their goodness. It was mine before anyone used it. Mine, while I chose to tell it. Mine when I chose not to. The coordinator tucked the signed release into her folder. Thanks, Olivia. You're welcome. Outside, the evening air carried the first hint of spring. For years, I had thought freedom would feel like finally winning a place at the right table. It didn't. It felt like understanding that the chair, the table, the photograph, the story, and even the word family, only had as much authority over me as I chose to give them. And for the first time in my life, permission belonged entirely to me.